The grand lobby of the Las Vegas Combat Sports Expo buzzed with the kinetic energy of 100 conversations, camera flashes, fitness demos, and protein shake sponsorships. But all eyes slowly turned toward the main stage where rising MMA sensation Cody, the Reaper, Maddox stood grinning with the cockiness of a man who thought the world owed him a standing ovation. At just 29, Maddox was undefeated in the octagon, viral across social media, and notoriously brash, known almost as much for his vicious knockouts as for the arrogance that poured from him like cologne. The interviewer had asked a harmless, nostalgic question about who his childhood heroes were, and that's when Cody's lips curled into a smirk, and he rolled his eyes in a way that was already trouble. "Stallone? Come on," he said with a loud, exaggerated chuckle that echoed over the microphone and bounced off the glass walls of the convention center. "You mean the guy who plays make-believe boxing in Hollywood?" He mocked, puffing out his chest like a cartoon character doing an impression of a tough guy. The audience gave a mix of laughs and uneasy murmurs, unsure whether to cheer for the young lion's confidence or cringe at the blatant disrespect. "Look, I grew up watching Rocky II," Maddox continued, using his palms in a fake conciliatory gesture. "But let's get real. If that old man tried to throw a punch today, he'd need a stunt double just to lift his shoulder." There were uncomfortable chuckles in the front row, where a few veteran fighters stood with crossed arms, clearly bristling at the jabs being thrown. "Hey, Sly," Cody said, turning to the VIP section where Sylvester Stallone sat quietly, dressed sharp in a dark Italian suit, his signature sunglasses perched on his nose. "You're a legend like a museum legend. Time to let the real fighters shine." Cameras snapped wildly as gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd, a few audience members exchanging wide-eyed glances. Stallone didn't blink or flinch. He simply gave a subtle nod and crossed his arms over his chest, his expression unreadable, like a man who'd seen far worse than verbal barbs in his decades under the harsh heat of the spotlight. Next to him, a couple of younger fans leaned toward one another, whispering eagerly, expecting Stallone to either fire back or exit in offended silence. But he stayed seated, still as a stone. Maddox wasn't finished. Not even close. He paced across the stage like a stand-up comic chasing a viral moment, circling the moderator and waving the mic for emphasis. "I mean, can we all just stop pretending movie punches hurt?" he continued, scoffing with a fake jab and a theatrical wince. "They cut the shot before it lands, add the sound effect in post, and boom, everybody's crying about how real it looked. Meanwhile, I broke a guy's orbital bone last month. That wasn't sound design, baby, that was bone on bone." Somewhere backstage, a producer's earpiece buzzed as they debated whether to cut the live stream or let the moment go viral. Maddox fed off the rising attention like a man starving for applause, mistaking Stallone's silence for submission. He threw another slow-motion air punch, then clutched his back and hobbled around like an old man. "Oops, better call Medicare," he shouted, laughing at his own joke, shoulders bouncing. Behind the exaggerated confidence, though, there was a flicker of something less sturdy, a brittle kind of bravado that only looked unbreakable if you didn't stare too long. The moderator, a seasoned journalist, tried awkwardly to redirect the conversation, but it was too late. The clip was already online, already being memed, clipped, and captioned with lines like "Maddox destroys Stallone" and "movie star owned by real fighter." Then, with quiet precision, Stallone stood from his seat. It was like a spell broke across the room. Conversations died. Phones lowered. A strange hush fell, as if everyone instinctively knew something was about to change. At 78, Stallone didn't move like a frail man. He moved like a veteran of wars, both on screen and off, his physique no longer chiseled but still solid, built from decades of training, discipline, and grit. He stepped toward the edge of the stage with a poise that came not from ego, but from certainty. The moderator offered him the mic, and Stallone accepted it with quiet calm, giving Cody a long, deliberate stare before speaking. "You're right, Cody," he said, his voice instantly recognizable, low, gravelly, and steady. "I make movies. You fight for real. But you know what we both have in common?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and for the first time, Cody wasn't grinning. We both stand in front of millions of people and try to prove something, Stallone said, scanning the crowd. The difference is, one of us thinks that proving something means tearing others down. A ripple of murmurs followed. Being strong isn't just about muscle or knockouts. It's about character, about heart, about knowing when to talk and when to listen. Cody tried to cut in with a scoff, but Stallone didn't break stride. I've played fighters, but I've also trained with real ones. I've been in the ring not to pretend, but to prepare. For the role, for the pain, for the story. He took a slow breath, eyes still locked on Maddox. You may be in your prime, but I've learned a few things over the years, and one of them is this. Respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn. The crowd was locked in, caught between awe and anticipation. Stallone took one step closer, just enough to tighten the space between him and the younger man. So here's my proposal, he said, the edges of his mouth twitching into a challenge. Tomorrow, Forge Gym, just a little friendly exhibition. Nothing brutal. No cameras, unless you want them. Just me, you, and the ring. Cody blinked, clearly surprised. You serious? He said, voice wavering slightly behind the swagger. Dead serious, Stallone said. Unless you think I might land a movie punch. The crowd exploded, not in derision this time, but in thunderous applause, whistles, and shouts of support. Stallone handed the mic back to the moderator and stepped down, his presence commanding the room even as he walked away. Cody hesitated, then laughed awkwardly, clearly trying to recover. Sure, old man, he shouted after him. Bring your director, too. But there was a crack in his voice that hadn't been there before. People saw it. The arrogance had started to wobble. As Stallone disappeared into the wings, Cody turned back to the cameras, trying to reclaim the spotlight. But something had shifted. The crowd's loyalty, the tone of the room, even the buzz online. For the first time in his rising career, Cody, the Reaper Maddox, didn't look invincible. He looked unsure. The Forge Gym sat nestled in the industrial heart of downtown Las Vegas, a warehouse-turned-temple of iron and sweat known to insiders as the place where legends went to disappear and re-emerge tougher than ever. And by 6 a.m. the next morning, it buzzed with quiet tension as a handful of trainers, former fighters, and select media gathered under orders to keep things low profile but ready. Sylvester Stallone arrived in a black hoodie, gloves slung over his shoulder, accompanied by his longtime friend and boxing advisor Pedro Salas, a Cuban-born trainer who had worked behind the scenes of every Rocky film since the beginning and whose approval meant more to Stallone than any crowds. He didn't say much as he laced up his boots, his breath calm, his movements patient, like a man who had already made peace with the pain. Maddox arrived 20 minutes later in a designer tracksuit, flanked by a personal videographer, a hype man, and a sleepy assistant holding a branded energy drink, the entire entourage dripping with swagger and streaming the moment live for over 800,000 viewers on Instagram. He strutted into the gym like a celebrity entering a party, barking jokes and grinning at the cameras, pretending not to notice the way several eyes refused to meet his with approval. Hope you're ready for your nap, Gramps, Maddox shouted across the ring as Stallone wrapped his wrists slowly. I brought a pillow, just in case you hit the mat too hard. Stallone looked up only briefly, offered a single nod, then went back to rapping, his silence louder than the insults. Pedro stepped in for a moment, checking Stallone's stance, whispering something that made the older man crack a small smile, like an old lion reminded he still had teeth. By 7 o'clock, the cameras were rolling, 3 official setups, 1 live stream, and a few iPhones held discreetly by trainers. The rules were simple. Light contact, 3 rounds, no knockouts, just movement and technique, but everyone in the room knew the real fight was never going to be about fists. They touched gloves with a surprising formality. Maddox smirking, Stallone unreadable. And then the first bell rang with a sound that sliced through the silence. Maddox came out fast, circling wide, bobbing like he was in Madison Square Garden, throwing loose jabs that snapped with flair but missed by inches, clearly putting on a show. Stallone didn't chase. He stood grounded, watching like a predator, slipping the jabs with the kind of quiet economy that comes from years of repetition and pain. When he finally moved, it was with surgical precision, A quick left that tapped Maddox's ribs, and a pivot that left the younger man overextended and blinking in surprise. The crowd murmured. Maddox's grin tightened. He upped the speed in round two, throwing more combinations, trying to test Stallone's conditioning. But the older man absorbed it all, moving just enough, countering with short, crisp strikes that showed he understood angles better than most modern fighters ever would. The gym smelled of canvas and blood memory, and Maddox was starting to sweat. Not from exertion, but from realization. Stallone's punches didn't hurt in the way a young man's did. They stung in the way a surgeon's scalpel might, clean and calculated, no wasted motion. "You've been practicing this choreo?" Maddox gasped between rounds, trying to sound amused, but his eyes betrayed him. "You move like you're reading my mind." "No," Stallone said calmly, breathing through his nose. "I just know the story before you write it." Round three changed everything. Maddox came in harder now, abandoning the flash and trying to land clean. He connected with a hard body shot that echoed off the walls and briefly staggered Stallone back a step. A few in the crowd winced, but Stallone's eyes only sharpened. He nodded once, as if granting permission, then launched into a counterattack so precise, so mechanical in its discipline, that Maddox couldn't do anything but react. A jab to the shoulder, a slip to the left, a feint that forced Maddox to drop his guard, and then a punch, not heavy, but placed exactly on the chin, that sent the MMA fighter stumbling backward in a moment too real to choreograph. No one said a word. Maddox's feet caught the ropes, and he stayed standing, but barely. Silence reigned for half a second. Then camera shutters began snapping like machine gun fire. Stallone didn't chase him down. He simply stepped back, gloves raised, waiting to see what Maddox would do next. The younger man wiped his mouth, found blood on his glove, and finally understood what everyone else had sensed the moment Stallone entered the gym. This wasn't about age or fame or legacy. It was about mastery, and the man across from him was still a master. Maddox lasted the round, but the crowd knew it. He was fighting not to win, but to survive without humiliation. When the final bell rang, there was no cheering, no celebration, just a long, collective exhale and the sound of gloves being lowered with reverence. Stallone stepped forward and touched gloves one more time, then nodded and began to unlace his gear, as if it were just another Tuesday. Maddox didn't speak for a minute. He sat on the stool, towel around his neck, staring at the floor like a kid who just saw his father cry for the first time. His crew stayed silent. Even the camera had stopped rolling. Finally, Cody stood, walked over, and held out a hand. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "You're not a movie fighter. You're the realest one I've ever seen." Stallone took the hand and pulled him in for a hug, surprising everyone, and whispered something only Maddox could hear, something that made the younger man nod and blink hard like he'd just been told the truth about himself. Pedro smiled from the corner. "That's the thing about old lions," he said aloud. "They don't need to roar. They just remind you they still got teeth." Maddox turned to the small crowd, now filled with respect instead of bravado. "No showboating," he said, raising Stallone's hand. "No trash talk, just respect." He looked at the cameras now being turned back on. "If you're going to clip something, clip this." Stallone waved off the fanfare, but it was too late. Within minutes, the footage of the final round hit social media. Not from Maddox's team, but from an anonymous trainer, and the world reacted with shock and awe. The headlines flipped overnight. Stallone silences Maddox in sparring masterclass, respect earned in blood and sweat, and the most viral of all, he thought it was just acting, until it wasn't. That evening, every major sports outlet ran the story, not as a humiliation, but as a lesson about what it means to be a fighter, a man, and a legend who doesn't need to prove anything anymore, but still does it anyway. Cody Maddox released a video apology the next day, eyes swollen, voice steady. "I forgot that being a champion isn't just about belts," he said. "It's about humility. I learned that yesterday." Stallone, when asked to comment by a swarm of reporters outside his hotel, simply smiled and said, "It was a good workout." In the weeks that followed the now legendary exhibition at Ford Gym, the combat sports world underwent a rare cultural pause, as if someone had hit rewind on the reckless speed of viral fame to remind everyone of the values that once defined the fight game: discipline, humility, and respect. The footage of Stallone's poised dismantling of Cody Maddox had spread across every platform, not as a hit piece, but as a quiet, moving testament to generational wisdom, standing tall in a world obsessed with youth and spectacle. Where once Maddox's name had been associated with trash talk and testosterone-fueled bravado, it was now inseparably linked to a very public humbling. And to his credit, Cody embraced it. He stopped posting shirtless gym selfies and started filming short behind-the-scenes documentaries, highlighting the trainers, cut men, and sparring partners who had helped build his career, people he'd never acknowledged before the encounter. The first of these videos was titled "The Day I Got Schooled by Rocky," and it opened with a still shot of Stallone lacing his gloves in silence, followed by Maddox narrating, "I thought I understood strength until I met Grace in the ring." The comments section was flooded not with mockery, but with gratitude. Fans, fighters, even former critics praised his transformation, noting how rare it was to see a man so publicly change direction without trying to spin the narrative in his favor. Even Stallone, usually private and reserved, took notice. He sent Maddox a short message through Pedro. "Growth looks good on you." The words landed like a father's blessing, and for the first time in his career, Cody felt something deeper than victory. He felt purpose. That month, Stallone and Maddox were invited to speak together on a sports leadership panel in Los Angeles, and the room sold out within hours. Maddox wore a plain black tee and jeans. No entourage, no swagger, just clarity in his posture and calm in his voice. Stallone, ever the minimalist, wore dark denim and a leather jacket that had probably seen more history than the venue itself. When asked what had changed him, Maddox didn't hesitate. "I met someone who didn't need to hit hard to hit deep." Stallone chuckled at that, but said nothing, letting Cody carry the conversation. People asked if it was embarrassing. Maddox continued, "The truth is, it was liberating. I wasn't beat down. I was brought up." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. And it made me want to be better. Not just a better fighter, but a better man. The panel concluded with a standing ovation, and the two men exited side by side, no longer framed as rivals, but as mentor and student, brothers forged not by blood, but by shared truth in the ring. A week later, a rumor circulated that Maddox had begun quietly training under Pedro Salas during off hours. No cameras, no interviews, just sweat and silence. Some thought it was just PR spin, but insiders at Forge confirmed it. Maddox was showing up before sunrise, pushing himself through drills older than his career, repeating fundamentals like a white belt all over again. "He doesn't ask questions anymore," Pedro said in an interview. "He just listens. That's how you know he's serious." Stallone kept his distance, never hovering, never instructing, but always watching. On one particular morning, as the light filtered through the dusty gym windows and Maddox completed his fifth round of bag work, Stallone approached him and handed over an old copy of The Fighter's Mind by Sam Sheridan, worn and dog-eared. "This helped me once," he said simply. Maddox nodded and tucked the book into his gear bag like it was sacred. The media, always hungry for a comeback narrative, began shifting the spotlight back onto Cody, but this time the tone had changed. ESPN ran a feature titled "The Fighter Who Grew Up in Public," and Bleacher Report called his turnaround the most inspiring reversal since Tyson turned philosopher. Young fighters began referencing Stallone again, not just as a pop culture icon, but as a legitimate source of discipline, grit, and technical wisdom. An online trend called Sly Style exploded, where up-and-coming fighters filmed themselves shadowboxing in slow, deliberate form, emphasizing control over chaos. Meanwhile, Stallone quietly announced he would be funding a new initiative called the Quiet Corner, a program for retired fighters struggling with identity and mental health, offering them mentorship, therapy, and community. When asked why he was doing it, he simply replied, "Because the fight never really ends. It just changes shape." Maddox became one of the program's early donors, contributing anonymously until Pedro outed him in an interview with a smile. "He's paying it forward now," Pedro said, like Sly did for him. The final chapter of the story didn't come in a ring or under lights, but in a sunlit park in Philadelphia, where a bronze statue of Rocky Balboa still stood as a symbol of perseverance. Stallone and Maddox were invited to unveil a new plaque beneath the statue. Not about Rocky, but about real fighters. The plaque read, "Fighting isn't about how hard you hit. It's about how much you grow. Respect is the final round." As they stood there, the crowd quiet and reverent, Stallone placed a hand on Maddox's shoulder. "This one's yours too now," he said. Maddox didn't answer. He just looked up at the statue, then down at the plaque, and nodded. Later that evening, over a modest dinner at a corner Italian place in South Philly, Stallone finally spoke the words Maddox hadn't expected but had longed to hear. "You remind me of me, before I learned how to listen." Maddox smiled through a full heart. "You taught me how." And in that quiet moment, amid the clinking of silverware and the distant hum of street traffic, the story that began with mockery and almost derailed a legacy ended not with vengeance, but with understanding. The punch that started it all hadn't landed on a face. It had landed on a soul, reshaping both men in its aftermath. The world didn't remember it as a beatdown. It remembered it as a breakthrough. And in gyms across the country, young fighters didn't just shadowbox anymore. They trained with purpose, knowing that greatness wasn't measured by the crowd's cheers, but by the quiet way a man stood tall after being humbled.